From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We will run a sharp, clear election campaign which will bring us victory. We will win. We will win, and the public will win.
For the first time in Israeli history, Prime Minister has failed to form a new government, forcing a new election. Could this help kill the Trump administration's so-called Middle East peace plan? We'll speak to longtime Palestinian diplomat Hanan Ashrawi, who was recently denied a visa to come to the United States. Then we go to Oklahoma, the site of a landmark opioid trial. The state is accusing Johnson & Johnson of being the kingpin behind this public health emergency.
Anguish and heartbreak that Oklahoma families, businesses, communities, and individual Oklahomans is almost impossible to comprehend. How did this happen? At the end of the day, Your Honor, I have a short, one-word answer: greed.
And the Trump administration is facing criticism after scuttling plans to replace President Andrew Jackson's portrait on the $20 bill with abolitionist leader Harriet Tubman by 2020, the 100th anniversary of women being granted the right to vote.
The American people understood the importance of representation on the banknotes of the world's most powerful economy. Do you support Harriet Tubman being on the $20 bill?
I've made no decision as it relates to that, and that decision won't be made in as I said,
but there was a community process.
26.
There was a community process.
Again, it's a decision of the Secretary of the Treasury. Right now, my decision is focused on security features.
We'll speak to Kate Clifford Larson, author of Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Special counsel Robert Mueller Wednesday broke more than 2 years of silence over his investigation into Russian influence in the 2016 election, contradicting Attorney General Bill Barr's claim of Trump's total exoneration, saying he could not state that the president is innocent of a crime, namely obstruction of justice. Mueller's remarks came during a surprise appearance at the Justice Department, where he announced he'd wrapped up his work and was resigning as special counsel. Mueller repeated his finding that there was insufficient evidence to charge Trump and his campaign with a broader conspiracy with Russia, but he pointedly contradicted Attorney General Barr's assertion Mueller had concluded Trump was innocent of obstruction of justice. This is Robert Mueller.
A president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office. That is unconstitutional. Even if the charge is kept under seal and hidden from public view, that too is prohibited. The special counsel's office is part of the Department of Justice, and by regulation, it was bound by that department policy. Charging the president with a crime was therefore not an option we could consider. If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so. We did not, however, make a determination as to whether the president did commit a crime.
Mueller's public remarks prompted fresh calls for impeachment proceedings against the president. This is House Judiciary Chair Gerald Nadler.
With respect to impeachment question, at this point, all options are on the table, and nothing should be ruled out.
8 Democrats vying for the 2020 presidential nomination are now calling for the House to open impeachment proceedings. Cory Booker, Kirsten Gillibrand, and Pete Buttigieg joined the call for the first time Wednesday. They joined Senators Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren. Congressmember South Moulton, former Congressmember Beto O'Rourke, and former HUD Secretary Julian Castro. Meanwhile, Senator Bernie Sanders said Wednesday he would support the House Judiciary Committee if it opens impeachment proceedings. In Israel, new elections have been called after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu failed to form a coalition government after 6 weeks of negotiations following the April 9th election. The news comes as the United States is promoting a controversial Middle East peace plan drawn up by President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Kushner's in Israel today, along with Special Envoy Jason Greenblatt. But the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reports the political crisis in Israel could kill the U.S. plan. The U.S. has scheduled a conference in Bahrain next month to unveil part of the plan. Palestinian officials have already vowed to boycott the conference and have dismissed any attempts to tackle peace talks in the region without addressing human rights and the Israeli occupation. We'll have more on Israeli politics and Jared Kushner's so-called deal of the century after headlines with Palestinian diplomat Hanan Ashrawi in Ramallah. President Trump's national security advisor Wednesday blamed Iran for mines that damaged oil tankers in the Persian Gulf this month, as well as a recent drone attack on a Saudi oil pipeline. Speaking to reporters in the United Arab Emirates, John Bolton offered no evidence of Iranian involvement, instead asking, who else would you think is doing it? Somebody from Nepal? Unquote. Bolton also said Iran had no reason to walk away from the Iranian nuclear deal, his comments coming exactly a year after the U.S. did exactly that. This comes as the U.S. deployed an additional 900 troops to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. In Louisiana, lawmakers approved a bill Wednesday that would ban abortions once a fetal heartbeat can be detected, becoming the latest state to challenge the Supreme Court's landmark 1973 ruling in Roe v. Wade. Louisiana House lawmakers voted 79-23 for the bill, which outlaws abortions as early as 6 weeks into pregnancy, while providing no exemptions to people who become pregnant by rape or incest. The state's Democratic governor, John Bel Edwards, has promised to sign the bill into law. Walt Disney's chief executive officer, Robert Iger, said Wednesday his company is prepared to halt filming in the state of Georgia, a major hub for film and television production, if a recently passed ban on most abortions takes effect.
I think it's also likely to be challenged in the courts, and that could delay it. And we're being careful and cautious about it. But if it becomes law, I don't see how it's practical for us to continue to shoot there.
Disney's threat to boycott Georgia over its anti-choice law follows a similar move by Netflix earlier this week. In Geneva, Switzerland, 4 young women from Latin America who were raped as children and denied abortions brought lawsuits Wednesday against their governments before the UN Human Rights Committee. The women, who are now between 18 and 23, were 14 or younger when they were raped in Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Guatemala. All 4 dropped out of school after discovering they were pregnant. Their rapists were never brought to justice. In Argentina, a nationwide general strike against government austerity measures brought much of the South American nation to a standstill Wednesday. Argentina's unions called the 24-hour strike to protest against high inflation and deep cuts to social welfare benefits in exchange for a $56 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund. Wednesday's strike came one day after protesters gathered at the National Congress building in Buenos Aires in support of new legislation to decriminalize abortion. This is Argentine high school student Abril Gonzalez.
The only thing I'm hoping for is that legislators vote well and with their consciences this time, that they think of the lives of the girls that have died from secret abortions and subhuman conditions, and that they let legalization become law.
In Honduras, tens of thousands of protesters joined striking educators in the streets of the capital, Tegucigalpa, and other major cities in recent days, protesting plans by President Juan Orlando Hernandez's government to privatize health care, pensions, and education. The reforms would also expedite budget cuts and ignite mass layoffs. The government said Tuesday it would enforce sanctions and criminal charges against teachers and medical personnel involved in any of the demonstrations. Dozens of protesters were injured Monday as roadblocks and other mobilizations throughout Honduras were met with tear gas and violent repression from the Honduran police and military. In the central U.S., officials in 7 states issued tornado warnings Wednesday, making it the 14th straight day of severe weather that shattered previous records for the month of May. In just the last week alone, tornadoes have been linked to at least 7 deaths and scores of injuries. Over the past 30 days, meteorologists have logged more than 500 tornadoes across the United States, a record total that's consistent with models predicting more extreme weather due to climate change. The Trump administration has branded methane, a major source of greenhouse gas emissions driving the global climate crisis, as freedom gas. The rebranding came as part of a Department of Energy news release Tuesday, hailing increased exports from the Freeport liquefied natural gas terminal in Texas. U.S. Undersecretary of Energy Mark Menezes said of the project, increasing export capacity from the Freedom LNG project is critical to spreading freedom gas throughout the world. He was joined by Assistant Secretary for Fossil Energy, Stephen Wimberg, who said, quote, I am pleased that the Department of Energy is doing what it can to promote an efficient regulatory system that allows for molecules of U.S. freedom to be exported to the world. unquote. The White House attempted to cover up all references to the late Republican Senator John McCain at a U.S. naval base in Japan ahead of President Trump's arrival there on a state visit earlier this week. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, which published a photograph showing a gray tarp covering the name USS John McCain on the side of the massive naval destroyer bearing McCain's name. The Journal reports sailors aboard the ship, who normally wear caps with John McCain's name on them, were given the day off during Trump's visit. At the last minute, officials appeared to reverse course and remove the tarp for Trump's visit, though a barge was moved closer to the USS John McCain to obscure Trump's view of the warship. WikiLeaks is warning its founder, Julian Assange, is in deteriorating health and has dramatically lost weight since he was jailed last month in London's Belmarsh prison. In a statement, WikiLeaks said Assange had been transferred to the prison's health ward, and his lawyer, Per Samuelson, told reporters, quote, Assange's health situation on Friday was such that it was not possible to conduct a normal conversation with him, unquote. Assange was due to appear by video link before a magistrate's court today, but failed to appear reportedly due to health problems. The Trump administration is seeking Assange's extradition to the United States to face 17 counts of violating the World War I-era Espionage Act, which could see Assange jailed for more than 170 years. Press freedom advocates have denounced the charges as direct assault on the First Amendment aimed at chilling investigative reporting. Vice President Joe Biden is facing a backlash on social media over his comments to and physical contact with a young girl at a campaign event in Houston, Texas. On Tuesday, Biden joined a town hall meeting held by the American Federation of Teachers, where he promoted his education plan, the first major policy announcement of his 2020 presidential campaign. Asked by a 10-year-old about political divisions within the United States, Biden concluded his answer with this exchange.
I tell you what, honey, what I'm going to do, if you give me an address, I'm going to write you a longer answer and tell you the exact things I would do, okay? Okay? Promise? I'll bet you're as bright as you're good looking, I tell you.
Joe Biden then put both hands on the girl's shoulders, marched her over to the assembled reporters, at one point leaning in close to her head. Last month, Biden said he would be more mindful of people's personal space after two women stepped forward to accuse him of inappropriate touching. Biden's not apologized for the incidents. And in New York City, the winners of the 2018 Pulitzer Prize Awards gathered for a lunchtime ceremony Wednesday with one conspicuous absence. Yemeni journalist Maad al-Zikri, who was barred from entering the United States to receive his prize after the Trump administration denied him a visa. Al-Zikri was part of an investigative team of Associated Press journalists who uncovered torture at secret prisons run by the United Arab Emirates in southern Yemen. In a statement, the Associated Press said it was terribly disappointed that Al-Zikri was unable to attend the ceremony. Yemen is one of 6 majority Muslim countries whose citizens are barred from entering the United States under an executive order signed by President Trump and upheld by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 ruling. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. New elections have been called in Israel after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu failed to form a coalition government after 6 weeks of negotiations following the April 9th election. This marks the first time in Israeli history a prime minister designate has failed to form a coalition government. The news comes as the United States is promoting a controversial Middle East peace plan drawn up by President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Kushner is in Israel today, along with Special Envoy Jason Greenblatt, but the Israeli newspaper Haaretz reports the political crisis in Israel could kill the U.S. plan. The U.S. has scheduled a conference in Bahrain next month to unveil part of the plan. Palestinian officials have already vowed to boycott the conference and have dismissed any attempts to tackle peace talks in the region without addressing human rights and the Israeli occupation.
We go now to the West Bank city of Ramallah, where we're joined by longtime Palestinian diplomat Hanan Ashrawi, member of the Palestine Liberation Organization's Executive Committee, recently in the news after the United States denied her a visa to enter the United States. Well, it's great to have you with us, Dr. Ashrawi. If you could start off by talking about this historic development. For the first time since Israel became a state, the prime minister after election was not able to form a government. What is the significance of this for Israel and for the Israeli-occupied territories where you are right now?
Well, basically, the main conflict within the Israeli political system is between the right and the far right and the ideological right. So the confrontation has been between the religious extremists and the political right wing on issues pertaining to the army and the religious recruitment and the recruitment of religious people to the army. This is one thing. This is one reason why the government wasn't formed, because Netanyahu couldn't muster a majority, one. But two, other than his overweening pride and ambition, Netanyahu certainly wants by any means possible to avoid being legally pursued and prosecuted. He wanted full immunity for the indictments on issues of corruption, abuse of power, and so on. And therefore he was willing to dissolve the parliament to preempt the president's right to choose somebody else, to ask him or her to form a new government. So this way he preempted the president, dissolved parliament, and called for elections, which are to be held in September. The internal domestic issues and all the different contradictions within Israel in many ways, and the shift to the extreme right and to the ideological and racist positions within the political circles in Israel have led to this impasse. And I think you're going to see even more of that, because the peace camp has all but disappeared. There is no left opposition to speak of. And the Palestinian Israelis are being totally marginalized and excluded. And the Palestinians in the occupied territories are only on the receiving end of what happens. Now, when you talk about the so-called peace plans, the American timetable, in addition to the American substance dealing with the peace plan, has been formed on the basis of Israeli priorities and on the basis of Israeli domestic politics. And therefore, every time something happens in Israel, this U.S. administration sort of mobilizes either to campaign for Netanyahu or to help him put together a coalition. And at the same time, the ball has been kicked down the road on this peace plan in order to give Israel more time to create more facts, and for the U.S. also to create more facts, to prejudge the real issues of negotiations, and at the same time carry out diversionary tactics to say the issue is only an economic issue. All we need to do is give the Palestinians a handful of, or a fistful of dollars, and they will accept their captivity. We will make it more palatable or less unpleasant, so to speak. So the issue now is that this relationship between the U.S. administration and Israel has subjected international law, the will of the international community, the imperatives and requirements of peace, as well as Palestinian rights, to this partnership in crime. How do we maintain this extremist coalition in Israel? How do we serve Netanyahu's interests, and at the same time, how do we subject or even transform American policy to suit this extremist government's priorities in Israel?
Well, Dr. Ashrabi, I want to turn to remarks that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made Wednesday after the results were announced. He railed against former Defense Minister and far-right politician Avigdor Lieberman for refusing to back him, accusing Lieberman, who is, of course, right-wing, of being part of the left.
It is just unbelievable, just unbelievable. Avigdor Lieberman is now part of the left. Avigdor Lieberman is part of the left. He is from the left's bloc. You give him votes for the right, and he doesn't give his vote to the right-wing government. This is what we see.
So, Dr. Ashrabi, that's Netanyahu speaking Wednesday, calling Lieberman a part of the left. Could you respond to that?
I mean, that's ridiculous. You can't dignify that with a response, because Lieberman is known as one of the most extremist, right-wing, racist politicians in Israel, and he has been one of the mainstays of Netanyahu's coalition. But he's, as usual, you know, the Israeli government is like the American administration. They sort of deal with manufactured facts. But anyway, the thing is, Lieberman stands for the secular extreme right, And therefore, when Netanyahu sided with the religious extreme right, Netanyahu accused Lieberman of being a left-wing politician, when we know very well that there are several poles within the extreme right and the racist right and the ideological right. He represents the secular racist right. And he's in competition with Netanyahu and has been, and relations have not been well between them. So I don't want to analyze Israeli politics, but very clearly you can brand or you can label anybody the way you want if it suits your purposes. And this has been, a constant trick of Netanyahu's.
I'd like to turn to Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, giving his assessment of the situation in Palestine and the Trump administration's peace plan. He was speaking earlier this month at the Washington Institute on Near East Policy.
You've got, Hamas obviously in Gaza, which has just driven that place into the ground, and it's really, I think the people are hostages to a terror organization, and that's an unfortunate situation. And then in the West Bank, I think you have people who are pretty repressed, and again, I think that they question whether the leadership is actually looking after their interests or not. And so, again, I think that for the Palestinians, the political aspirations are important. I do believe what we'll put out will address a lot of their political aspirations and a lot of their dignity. That is important to us. We know what's in the plan. We believe that it's virtuous. We believe that it's something that is beneficial to both sides, and it's been very disheartening for us to see that the Palestinian leadership has basically been attacking a plan that they don't know what it is, as opposed to reaching out. If they truly cared about making the lives of the Palestinian people better, I think they would have taken different decisions over the last year, and maybe over the last 20 years.
So that's Jared Kushner giving his assessment of the situation in Palestine, criticizing the Palestinian leadership, saying if they cared about Palestinians, they would have taken a different approach. Again, Jared Kushner in Israel today, along with the Middle East envoy, Greenblatt, who is the former real estate lawyer for Donald Trump. Of course, the Israeli U.S. ambassador to Israel, Friedman, is Trump's former bankruptcy lawyer. Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, if you can talk about this plan and what Jared Kushner said about the Palestinian leadership and the plans of the leadership not to participate in the Bahrain talks, what they call a workshop.
Yeah. Well, actually, this is quite, it's a workshop. Actually, this is quite a large topic because in many ways it encapsulates everything that's wrong with this administration and their foreign policies and their total disdain for international law and for the rights of the Palestinian people. It's ironic that somebody like Jared Kushner is talking about or appointing himself as being more concerned about the Palestinian people's well-being than the Palestinian leadership. Does he want a regime change? It's been tried before. Is he looking for collaborators? I know that they are trying to get collaborators to go to this conference or to this workshop. But it's the American administration that has severed ties, that has closed down our office in Washington, that has closed down the Consulate General in Jerusalem, and which was opened in 1844 and now turned us into a Palestinian Affairs Unit within the illegally placed American Embassy in Jerusalem. They have decided to accept Israel's illegal annexation of Jerusalem, the way later on they accepted Israel's illegal annexation of the Golan Heights. They have attempted to destroy, to defund the UNRWA and to redefine the Palestinian refugees. These are the core issues on which peace is based. They have refused to acknowledge the 67 borders. They have refused to acknowledge the two-state solution, i.e. Palestinian sovereignty, Palestinian freedom and independence. And now what they're trying to say, they have, of course, defunded Palestine completely, including our hospitals, our schools, our infrastructure, including scholarships given to students to study in the States and so on. So in a sense, what they've done is they've bashed the Palestinians, they've punished the Palestinians. They think that we have to submit, that we have to surrender, and we have to declare that we are defeated. As Daniel Pipes said and Jared Kushner echoed, that they have to get it into our heads that we are a defeated people. Our response is that we are not defeated. We may be under occupation, we may be constantly subject to all sorts of punitive measures and threats and blackmail and immoral, illegal steps by Israel and the U.S., But our spirit has not been defeated, and we have persisted, and we are a resilient people, and we will continue because we have rights, and our political agenda is firmly based on total respect for human rights, for international law, for international humanitarian law, and of course for international precedent after the Second World War, where the weak and the vulnerable are supposed to be protected by a global rule of law, and the strong and coercive and oppressive powers have to be held in check and have to be held accountable by international law. So we know what our rights are. Foremost among them is our right to self-determination, to freedom, to dignity on our own land. By trying to tell us, you have to submit, you have to accept defeat, and we will force you to turn the Palestinian issue of freedom and sovereignty into an issue of dollars and a handout to Palestinian people, when we can build the best, the most vibrant, robust economy if we are in control of our own lives, our own lands, our own resources, our airspace, our entry-exit points, our territorial waters. We are capable of having a vibrant economy. We do not want any handouts. What we want is our freedom and our ability to control our own lives and resources in order to give the Palestinian people the prosperity they deserve. There can be no prosperity, no development under occupation. And prosperity doesn't lead to peace. This has been tried before and it has failed.
Well, Dr. Ashravi, I'd like to turn to one of Trump's key advisors on the Middle East, Trump's Middle East envoy, Jason Greenblatt, who was also Trump's former real estate lawyer. This is Greenblatt addressing the UN Security Council earlier this month.
It is truly shameful that in these halls, there have been nearly 700 resolutions condemning actions of Israel, the region's only real democracy, yet not one condemning Hamas's attacks on Israelis or its abuse and neglect of the very people it purports to govern. Forget about Israel for a minute. How does that help Palestinians, especially Palestinians in Gaza? Forgive me for pointing out the elephant in the room, which is that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, not Israel, are the problem here.
So that's Trump's Middle East envoy, Jason Greenblatt, speaking at the Security Council earlier this month. You responded to his remarks by tweeting, quote, "This self-appointed advocate apologist for Israel claims not only to know what's good for the Palestinians, but also claims that he knows them better than they know themselves. Patronizing, condescending hubris," you tweeted, Dr. Ashravi. So could you talk about the kinds of people who are advising President Trump and what you actually expect will happen at this so-called workshop next month in Bahrain?
Yeah. Well, my tweet was not in response to this statement, where, as usual, blame the victim or look the other way, avoid the fact of the occupation itself, avoid the fact that Israel has committed hundreds and thousands of human rights violations and has refused to comply with all UN resolutions, every single one of them. That's why there are resolutions against Israel, not because people choose to discuss Israel, but because Israel persists in violating international law. And this sense of condescending arrogance that we know what's good for the Palestinians. Look at Hamas. Well, we know what are the problems, the domestic issues we have. What we need to do is ensure that the occupation ends and that the U.S. does not become complicit or a partner in the crime of occupation. Now, that's the real problem. You have here extreme right-wing ideologues. Trump has put together a team. As you rightfully pointed out, they are either bankruptcy lawyers or they are real estate lawyers, and his brother and his son-in-law, sorry. Nepotism is not a word here. So, and all of them are committed to Israel. They are committed ideologically to Israel. In religious terms, Israel to them is the gift of God. Therefore, somebody like Friedman can speak openly and say that Israel is on the side of God. I wonder what God will do without Israel being on its side. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is the first I've heard of such a statement. Or even somebody like Pompeo, who says that God sent Trump to save Israel from Iran. I mean, is this how you make 21st century politics? Is this how you deal with geopolitical realities based on international law, on parity, on the recognition of the imperatives of peace and coexistence and so on? Or do you start invoking biblical texts and the Old Testament and so on in order to justify contemporary injustices. And then somebody like Greenblatt and others keep saying, well, this is an outdated argument. These are archaic arguments. You don't go back to your old arguments, while they're going back and reciting the Bible to us, a 3,000-year-old text, as being the basis of 21st century decisions. And yet we are not supposed to talk about freedom, human rights, dignity. These are really calcified arguments. So there is a certain degree of blind commitment emanating from a very strong ideological fundamentalist faith that has dominated decision-making. And that's why we feel that this is extremely dangerous. Whenever you bring God into a conflict, you turn it into a religious conflict, it becomes a matter of absolutism, absolute right versus absolute wrong, and therefore you can justify whatever you do to the other because you negate the very humanity and all the rights of the other.
Dr. Hanan Ashrawi,
this kind of team that he...
Can you respond to the U.S. denying you a visa to come to the United States?
Again, I'm sorry, I keep smiling whenever you ask me a question because, I mean, we thought from the ridiculous to the sublime or vice versa. It's absolutely ridiculous. There's no reason to deny me a visa. I exercise my right to freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression. I thought this is something that the American system totally respects. I don't see any justification. I have not been given any justification. I haven't even been given a denial in writing. I was just told that Washington rejected the visa application. And as you know, I've written about this. I've been to the States, scores, if not hundreds of times. I studied there. I have family there, grandchildren, daughters, sister, and nephews and nieces and so on. But this is, again, another way in which they sink to certain personal levels even to punish people who stand up to them, who disagree with them, who persist in defending Palestinian rights. I'm not going to change my positions, my principles, and my total commitment to Palestinian rights in order to avoid being bashed by the American administration.
Dr. Ashrawi, we
have stood up.
You tweeted after you were denied the visa by the Trump administration. You tweeted, I've met and even negotiated with every Secretary of State since Schultz and every president since George H.W. Bush. But I want to ask you also about your recent meeting with Matt Duss, the foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders. Can you talk about where you met and what you discussed?
Well, I did, yes, issue a statement. I've known Matt for some time, since he was head of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and now he's the senior advisor to Bernie Sanders on international affairs. He's a very knowledgeable person. He's somebody who does his homework in the sense that he studies the issues, he meets the people, and he's a very thoughtful person, well-read. Which is a rarity these days. You need people who have knowledge, who do not, sort of move on the basis of ignorance. And we talked about, of course, Bernie Sanders. We were saying how ironic it was that Palestinians were pushing for a Jewish president for the U.S. when the Israelis were pushing for an extreme evangelical president for the U.S. Anyway, we feel that the position of Bernie Sanders, among others, we're not singling him out as being the one person. There's a whole spectrum now, fortunately, in Congress and in the Senate and the House, people who have the courage to speak out, people who have the courage to call the occupation by its name, and who have the foresight to try to address the real issues and to see how to end the occupation, how to bring justice to the Palestinian people, how to make this narrative acceptable instead of people trying to silence and distort the Palestinian narrative and voice. And fortunately now within American public opinion and universities, among groups, minorities, women's groups and so on, we see an emerging sense of liberation, of the ability to speak out, to address justice for the Palestinians without being labeled anti-Semitic and without, having the law distorted like, BDS and so on, to criminalize anybody who tries to work in ways that are consistent with his or her conscience in defending Palestinian rights and seeking a just peace in the region. So among them, there's Bernie Sanders, and we have listened carefully, and we see a progression in terms of his position. I've met other candidates as well who came to Palestine. I met Matt. We had a good meeting at my office at the PLO headquarters. And we sent messages to Bernie Sanders, as well as we send messages directly also to others, because we believe we can have a real engagement, a genuine, candid contact and discussion and conversation on the issues, because the strident language of hate and distortion and so on is really counterproductive and dangerous to both sides. And that's why I think the more conversations we have, the more discussion, the more candid talks that we have, the more we clarify the issues, the better would be and the more informed would be decision-making in the U.S.
Dr. Ashrawi, before we conclude, if you could just say what you expect will happen next month at the June meeting in Bahrain. Are there Arab countries who are participating, and Palestinians, including yourself, the Palestinian leadership, are they boycotting the secret Kushner plan?
Well, the Kushner plan is not much secret when it comes to the real issues, Jerusalem and refugees and borders and the two-state solutions and settlements being illegal and so on. They've done everything to prejudge and destroy the real issues. Now they're talking about economic issues, as they said, and they're trying to get the Arabs to foot the bill in order to give the Palestinians a handout and in order to integrate Israel economically within the region. So it is putting the Arab Peace Initiative on its head, asking the Arabs to normalize with Israel while Israel is still an occupying power, occupying Palestinian land, annexing Palestinian land, occupying Arab Syrian land, annexing Arab land, and so on. This is really rewarding the aggressor and trying to normalize before Israel is brought to compliance with international law, number one. Number two, I think this whole workshop is much ado about nothing. There's a lot of talk, trying to persuade people that the U.S. has something to say, something to do. They're going around trying to persuade Arabs to attend. I don't think this will have any significance now. Also, given the fact that their ally and best friend Israel is in deep political trouble, and their man in the region, Netanyahu, is still seeking re-election. So I would say that they managed to get some Arab countries. They convinced Bahrain to host this, for heaven's sake. They convinced Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to immediately announce that they're attending. Even Qatar announced that it's attending. I know that there are many countries who have other political calculations and interests and who do not want to stand up to the U.S. And the U.S. can use different means to threaten, bash, cajole, bribe, whatever they want other countries. This administration has used these tactics. With us, they use, punitive measures, sanctions, very cruel measures. They can, punish the sick in terms of defunding hospitals in Jerusalem, or they can punish students by suspending their scholarships or whatever. So they have done this. They have stopped any funding on the Palestinians, ironically, and then they are saying we're holding an international workshop to see how to make the Palestinian lives better, how to give them more quality of life while carrying out an economic integration of the region. Now, we are not stupid, and I think that this not only insults our own intelligence, it's a real insult to the real requirements of peace and to the international community and to the people who are attending and to the people who are trying to justify their attendance by saying, let the leadership do something good for its own people. Well, get the Israeli boot off our neck, stop the American boycott and American threats to defund all of Palestine, get Israel to give us our money that it is stealing and withholding our customs funds, and that's what we need. Then deal with the real issues. The real issues are self-determination, freedom, sovereignty, dignity, rights on our own land. That's what we need. And if you avoid all the real issues and start devising, distractions and diversionary tactics, they're not going to get you anywhere. And I doubt whether the Arabs are willing to foot the bill.
We want to thank you very much for being with us. Palestinian diplomat and scholar, elected an executive committee member of the Palestine Liberation Organization. In 2009, became the first woman to hold a seat in the highest executive body in Palestine. She was just denied a visa by the United States government to come into this country. When we come back, we go to Oklahoma, where for the first time in pharmaceutical company Johnson & Johnson is on trial for its role in the opioid crisis. The Attorney General of Oklahoma calls them a drug, quote, kingpin. Stay with us.
Anything you can do, I can do better.
Anything you can do, I can do better. I can do anything better than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
Anything you can be, I can be greater. Sooner or later, I'm greater than you.
No, you're not.
Yes, I am.
No, you're not.
Yes, I am.
No, you're not.
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. I can shoot a partridge with a single cartridge.
I can get a sparrow with a bow and arrow.
I can live on bread and cheese.
And only on that?
Yeah.
So can a rat.
Any note you can reach, I can go higher.
I can sing anything higher than you.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't.
Yes, I can.
No, you can't. No, you can't.
All right, you win, you big show-off.
Don't ask me to do that again.
Anything you can buy, I can buy cheaper. I can buy anything cheaper than you.
50 cents.
Anything you can do, I can do better. From the Broadway musical Annie, Get Your Gun. A lawyer representing the state of Oklahoma quoted this song in the landmark trial, accusing Johnson & Johnson of fueling the opioid crisis. He said the company competed with Purdue Pharma using aggressive marketing. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Well, we turn now to Oklahoma, where for the first time a pharmaceutical company is on trial for its role in the opioid crisis. Johnson & Johnson, the corporate giant better known for its baby products, produces a fentanyl patch and previously also manufactured an opioid pill. In opening statements Tuesday, lawyers made a sweeping case against the company, accusing it of driving demand for opioids while the drug ravaged the state of Oklahoma. The state says Johnson & Johnson targeted children and veterans to sell opioids. In court filings, Attorney General Mike Hunter likened Johnson & Johnson to a kingpin that's been targeting an unsuspected public since the 1990s. This is Hunter speaking at the trial Tuesday.
The pain, anguish, and heartbreak that Oklahoma families, businesses, communities, and individual Oklahomans is almost impossible to comprehend. How did this happen? At the end of the day, Your Honor, I have a short, one-word answer: greed. Decades ago, the defendants and their corporate collaborators rushed to fill the need the medical community created to address the fifth vital sign. Our evidence will show, Your Honor, that in their zeal to provide a magic drug, they ignored centuries of experience, well-documented scientific histories of deadly addiction epidemics, and embarked on a cynical, deceitful, multi-million-dollar brainwashing campaign to establish opioid analgesics as the magic drug.
Purdue Pharma settled with Oklahoma in March for $270 million, and Teva Pharmaceuticals reached an $85 million settlement deal on Sunday, just ahead of the landmark trial. This leaves Johnson & Johnson's the only defendant in the first civil trial of its kind. The trial is expected to last 2 months, will set the stage for nearly 1,900 federal and state lawsuits targeting drug makers and distributors pending around the country. Well, for more, we go to Jan Hoffman, a reporter for the New York Times covering the landmark opioid trial. Welcome to Democracy Now! Jan, talk about the significance of this trial in Oklahoma and why specifically we're talking not Purdue Pharma, but Johnson & Johnson.
This is the first trial of many that are really on the nationwide runway. Everyone is watching to see what formally sealed and redacted documents will now come into the public that will tell a much broader and deeper story than the one we've known about already. Everyone is watching to see how certain legal arguments will play and to see what the pushback from one of the biggest manufacturers in the world, not necessarily of opioids, by the way, Johnson & Johnson will use as a defense. This will affect not only the forthcoming federal trials slated for October 21st in Cleveland, Ohio. Ironically, this is taking place in Cleveland County, Oklahoma, but will also very much affect settlement discussions that are ongoing at the state level and the federal level. Everyone's going to be watching Oklahoma to see how is this going to play out. Will this tip my hand at the table or will it not?
Well, you know, Teva Pharmaceuticals settled with Oklahoma, but the company actually said in a statement, quote, "The settlement does not establish any wrongdoing on the part of the company. Teva has not contributed to the abuse of opioids in Oklahoma in any way," they said, Teva Pharmaceuticals. So could you talk about that, the fact that both Purdue and Teva have settled with Oklahoma? How is it that only Johnson & Johnson has not?
Those are two separate questions. Actually, they're three. Why did Purdue Why did Purdue settle? Why did Teva settle? And why is Johnson & Johnson still on trial? Purdue settled, and some have criticized that settlement as chump change. Purdue settled because they had a terrific winning hand. They had the threat, and still do, of bankruptcy. Oklahoma had a very difficult decision to make. Could they take Purdue to trial, possibly get a big settlement, have it be attacked in the appellate courts, and then have a bankruptcy judge turn to Oklahoma and say, "I'm sorry, we are protecting we're protecting Purdue right now from any claims," and therefore Oklahoma would get nothing. Or they could say, let's settle this now, take what we can get, and call it a day. So I think that was very much the thinking behind Oklahoma and certainly behind Purdue as they settled this case. One of the big challenges for Purdue is to let it be known that this case is singular. They don't want it to be set as a precedent for what else they will be paying in other cases. That's a very tricky position for Purdue. Teva's different. Teva makes generics. The question is, did Teva promote these generics? Did they promote them as opioids and make certain claims to them? Teva didn't. It never promoted, as far as it says, the drugs. So the state's case against Teva was, frankly, weaker. Teva, which is also an enormous corporation, also got out for chump change. Remember, they paid less than half of what Purdue paid. This leaves Johnson & Johnson, whose, I think, 2017 or 18 sales were $81.6 billion worldwide. So Johnson & Johnson has the deepest pockets of all the three defendants so far. Johnson & Johnson is known as being a company that likes to go to trial. Nobody likes to go to trial. But when they're accused of something, they will fight, particularly if they feel they have a strong case. J&J is worried about setting precedent, worried about showing that they could lose at trial. Frankly, that they're worried about losing at the appellate courts, because whether they're going to prevail before a state court judges, you figure that one out. So they basically said, let's show them our hand, let's show them our defense, let's fight this case, let's bring it through the courts. We'll lose, frankly, in terms of damage to our reputation, but in the long run, we may win further down the road.
Oklahoma Attorney General Mike Hunter says over a 3-year period from 2015 to 2018 that there were 18 million prescriptions for opioids written in Oklahoma, which is a population of just under 4 million. 18 Correct. Million prescriptions for 4 million. Also, over 15 years, overdose deaths increased by 91%. These are extraordinary figures. And you have Johnson & Johnson lawyers saying, well, these drugs have FDA approval. Can you respond to both?
Sure. This is why the J&J lawyer, and believe me, I don't want to be seen as carrying water for J&J, but the J&J lawyer said, and this is the sort of crux of their defense, facts are stubborn things. When you start to drill down into that data, you see that you are not particularizing those overdose deaths from one drug to another, Are they from heroin? Are they from fentanyl? Are they from fentanyl from China? Are they from heroin from across the border? Are they from pill mills that were shut down because they were either illegal or criminal? We don't know. That's the problem in terms of establishing liability to J&J. There's no question that the country has been staggered by the opioid crisis or the opioid emergency. But the real legal question is, how do you apportion blame fairly? And that is a very high legal hurdle. Because in between, let me just say briefly, and one of the things Oklahoma is missing that other cases have is other cases have charged not only the manufacturers, but they've charged the distributors who were the direct salespeople to the pharmacies and did have an obligation to report to the DEA how many pills they were delivering to these pharmacies that were out of bounds. They have named pharmacy chains like CVS. They have named some individual doctors. So there are a lot of purportedly bad actors in this long chain of causality.
Well, Jan, could you talk about the broader impact of this opioid crisis? I mean, Oklahoma is largely a rural state, and it's been completely ravaged by this crisis. Is it the case that most of the states in the U.S. that are most affected are also principally rural? And talk about your own reporting specifically about the opioid epidemic amongst the Cherokee Nation.
It's true that I'll bifurcate that. It's true that certainly rural areas have been terribly hard hit, but you go to the Bronx and you will see how the opioid crisis has devastated the Bronx. It has gone from pills to heroin and fentanyl. So there's a trajectory there that has really hit urban areas as powerfully as it has rural areas, although it certainly began in rural areas. I mean, I spent a fairly long time in the ER in a hospital in Paterson, New Jersey, which was just assaulted with opioid overdoses. And New Jersey has been pummeled by this crisis. Thank you, Johnson & Johnson, which happens to be a New Jersey-based company. Again, I shouldn't have said that. We don't know yet to what degree Johnson & Johnson has liability for this. I went separately to the Cherokee Nation because they, among all the tribes in the United States, chose to bring their own case against this cluster of manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacies in tribal court. This was a novel and bold legal approach, and I wanted to see why they chose to take it to tribal court rather than joining the state of Oklahoma or even joining the federal litigation. And certainly the Cherokee Nation is arguably even harder hit than Oklahoma as a state has been. They certainly had cause to want us to bring justice to their people in their own courts. Ultimately, they didn't prevail in me keeping the case in tribal court.
Jan Hoffman, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Of course, we're going to continue to cover this landmark trial. Jan Hoffman, reporter for The New York Times, covering the opioid trial underway in Oklahoma. When we come back in 20 seconds, we look at, well, what's happened to that plan for Harriet Tubman to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. Stay with us. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
The Trump administration is facing criticism after scuttling plans to replace President Andrew Jackson's portrait on the $20 bill with abolitionist leader Harriet Tubman by 2020, the 100th anniversary of women being granted the right to vote. Massachusetts Democrat and freshman Congressmember Ayanna Pressley questioned Treasury Secretary Mnuchin last week.
Do you support Harriet Tubman being on the $20 bill?
I've made no decision as it relates to that, and that decision won't be made in as I said,
but there was a community process.
We go now to Boston, where we're joined by Kate Clifford Larson, the author of Bound for the Promised Land, Harriet Tubman, Portrait of an American Hero. Talk about what the plan was, Kate Clifford Larson, for replacing Harriet Tubman, who Harriet Tubman is, and what's happened.
Well, in April of 2016, then Secretary of the Treasury Jacob Lew announced that the $5, $10, and $20 notes would be redesigned to incorporate women into those designs onto our currency. And on the $20 note, he announced that Harriet Tubman would replace Andrew Jackson. And of course, we were all thrilled because there had been a process. People had voted across the country. A group of women had gotten together and started Woman on the 20 campaign. And overwhelmingly, Americans voted for Harriet Tubman to be the face of the $20 bill. And the design was started, and we were thrilled that the process was moving ahead. And once President Trump was brought into office, and then the process seemed to slow down, and now this recent announcement from Secretary Mnuchin that that decision won't be made now, it will be put off into the future. But actually, the decision was made, and the process was started, and the design is available. So we're all very, very frustrated because it's time that a woman is on our currency.
And explain who Harriet Tubman is, her history, her life.
Harriet Tubman is a remarkable human being and American hero. She was born enslaved on the eastern shore of Maryland in 1822. Had a horrific childhood, being separated from her family and hired out to other slaveholders. She was brutally beaten and neglected and starved, but she survived, and she grew up to be a remarkable, strong, brilliant woman who took her own liberty. She escaped from slavery, and then she returned well over, about 13 times to rescue her family and friends. I mean, nobody did that. It was so dangerous. And then during the Civil War, she was a spy and a scout and a soldier. And so she brought her battle against slavery to the South, and she helped win. And later in her life, she was a civil rights activist, an activist fighting for the right to vote. She deserved to vote, and it was denied her. She was a humanitarian and just a remarkable human being. And her legacy lives on. I mean, people never forgot who she was. She was famous during her lifetime, and she's even more famous today. And I think that people see in her what we as Americans hold so dearly, and that's the fight for freedom, that we represent freedom to people around the world who are oppressed. She represents that in so many different ways. And it's about time that our heroes are represented across gender and race, not just white men on our currency. We need to have women there, and Harriet Tubman is truly the best representation.
And she'd be replacing Andrew Jackson, the president who President Trump has called his favorite. He was a slaveholder who in 1830 signed the Indian Removal Act, which forced 16,000 Native Americans from their lands in what became known as the Trail of Tears. Your response?
It's very confusing that he would feel that Andrew Jackson deserved to be on the $20 bill, especially when we have an opportunity to have someone like Harriet Tubman, who actually fought for the freedom for all people, not to subjugate them and rip them from their homes. So I do find it very telling about President Trump and his administration. I feel that the decision that they've made to put this on hold is rooted in misogyny and racism.
Hey, Clifford Larson, we're going to do part 2 and put it online at democracynow.org. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Amy Goodman. Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks for joining us.